Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the debut album from Tangerine Dream, Electronic Meditation. Alright then, it's time to get started with the next discography review, and this is gonna be a big one. I have admittedly been given quite a few more opportunities to talk about 70s synth pioneers than I might have expected in the time since I last nailed down my current plans for these series, but I haven't done a full dedicated series on a band or artist from this era since the Jean-Michel Jarre series 5 years ago, and I felt like it was about time to return to that wellspring. So now I'm going to be talking about Tangerine Dream, the 70s synth band founded and led by the late Edgar Froese, and containing a multitude of other rotating band members over the years. Now, those more familiar with the catalog of Tangerine Dream, and those who haven't heard my announcements that I would be doing this, might be a little freaked out by the prospect of a full dedicated series on the discography of this band in particular, since, well, they're pretty prolific. I.e., they've released literal hundreds of albums kind of prolific. Their catalog is so massive that even their biggest core fans have a hard time keeping track of them all. If I were to cover every single album in a dedicated video, I'd be stuck here for like 6 straight years, alienate my viewer base for at least 5 of those years, and absolutely hate the band by the time I got to the end. A truly complete series on them would be no fun for anyone, least of all myself. Which is why I am going to be heavily limiting which projects I'm actually going to cover to just studio albums they've released from their formation through to 1986. No live albums, no soundtracks, nothing they've put out after 1986, none of those are getting dedicated videos, just their first 16 mainline studio albums up through Underwater Sunlight. That'll be more than enough. I'll probably tackle some of that other stuff in like an odds and ends at the end. But at the end of the day, like, I've made this parallel multiple times before, but I've always viewed Tangerine Dream as electronic music's equivalent to The Simpsons. Their pioneering work from the early days completely changed the landscape of music as we know it, and still mostly holds up to this day. But after a certain point, their catalog just starts stagnating really hard, and they stop delivering anything interesting. Not precisely bad or unlistenable stuff, not unlike how modern-day Simpsons isn't the worst thing in the world and is, inoffensively watchable enough. But it's just, a lot of the same stuff over and over, attempting to recapture the band's glory days with barely a fraction of the success. There's a good reason I've never properly covered this band in any dedicated videos before now. Even though they're still going to this day, even after Edgar Froese's death in 2015. That in itself never fully sat right with me, even if Froese may have specifically wanted it to happen. But that'll be another conversation for another day. I still consider myself enough of a fan of the band to want to highlight their early career in a series like this, so today we're going to be talking about the very beginning of the band's history. Even before they'd become the legendary synth pioneers putting out the well-publicized classics we know today. Tangerine Dream officially formed in 1967, and they'd already gone through several different lineups before even releasing any recorded output at all. But the first lineup of the band to actually record an album was something of a Berlin School supergroup. For this album alone, Tangerine Dream consisted of Edgar Froese on guitar, organ, and tape manipulations and some other stuff, working with Konrad Schnitzler on violin, cello, and mechanical calculator, and Klaus Schultz on all drums and percussion, both of the latter of whom we know would go on to see much greater success with their solo work as 70s synth legends in their own right. Also featuring some guest flute performances from Thomas Kieserling and some guest organ performances from Jimmy Jackson. One little catch, though. At this point, we're still in 1970. This is still from the days where all the big 70s synth outfits, especially the German ones like Tangerine Dream, weren't actually making electronic music quite yet. This comes from the era of experimental Krautrock. Electronic meditation is barely electronic at all. It has the word electronic in the title, and I'm told some custom-made electronic devices were used to make some of the sound effects you hear in this project, but they're pretty hard to make out, if that. It's primarily a freeform experimental rock album. The material on here is very much in the same vein as early Pink Floyd at their weirdest. Especially like the title track from A Saucer Full of Secrets, or Interstellar Overdrive from Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And I mean, maybe comparing music like this to Floyd can seem a bit cliche, but I'm fairly certain cuts like these have been cited as direct inspirations on the album. It's not even the last time in the Tangerine Dream catalog where you'd hear them directly taking inspiration from Pink Floyd. We'll get to some of that later. Now, that's all well and good. I think we know by now that I do love me some early Floyd type stuff. When I did my video ranking all their albums, I marked A Saucer Full of Secrets above Animals. But at the same time, music as completely out there as this can also occasionally be a bit much for my liking. Electronic Meditation is an album that's going out of its way to, like, avoid traditional melodic structures, or occasionally even avoiding melodies in general. It's extremely dissonant and freaky, even bordering on intentionally horrifying. Some of the packaging muses on what it might be like if your brain were set on fire, and features a number of pictures of dismembered baby doll parts. And there's no break or breather from the craziness throughout the 5 tracks on display here. It's a debut much more easily comparable to the way Krautrock started with their self-titled album. And honestly, that album might even technically be more easily accessible than this one. Not by much, if that, but even that album has Rook Zook on it, which technically has a tune to it. Though in terms of my own personal enjoyment, those 2 albums are about equally on par with each other. Which is to say, I think Electronic Meditation is an alright album. It's fine. Not something I'd really see myself choosing to listen to if not for the existence of this series, but it has its moments here and there. I can generally respect all of it for what it is. I do think it has a pretty solid first side. When the album starts with opener Genesis, there's some pretty strong build-up and all the stirring mixes of processed strings, getting more and more intense as Schultz slowly joins in with his increasingly tribal drumming, and lots of off-kilter flutes sneak in over the top. It creates some decently epic effect, and then that leads very well into the album's first centerpiece and the easy highlight of the album, the 12-minute Journey Through a Burning Brain, which itself evolves through a whole bunch of different passages, including Froisy's kinda surf guitar soloing, kinda sitting out in the open and creating some unnerving subspaces, organ surrounding the mix very much in the same way as the last section of A Saucer Full of Secrets did, and possibly coming the closest to any track here having like an ordinary melody or chord progression underscoring it that doesn't feel totally chaotic. Also building into lots of other driving guitar riffs and wails. There's a section that starts out with a fairly normal 60s psych rock groove, but that section just gets freakier and freakier as it goes along, and the guitars get way louder and more high-pitched and squeakier before culminating in an outro of more Floyd-style organs. A lot of cool ideas here. Keeps me pretty engaged for what it's going for. With that said, as we move into the second side of the album, it starts to feel like the album kinda ran out of steam and cycles through a bunch of the ideas that showed up on the first side without keeping me as well engaged. There's another, slightly shorter 10-minute centerpiece in Cold Smoke that I guess is cool, but was less cool than the cut it immediately follows. I mean, there's a lot of cool creepy ambience created by the strings and organs at first, but then it keeps like building up and down into all these very brief crashing sections that feel like they're trying to be jump scares without actually jump scaring you, I guess. And then finally getting back to rocking out at full force by the end. Again, cool track that I can respect well enough, and I think it justifies its length. But my attention pretty consistently trails off at this point. I start to get a little sick of the sound and style of everything. And unfortunately, the album fails to bring back my attention with either the last 2 tracks. Ashes to Ashes is an okay rock groove, but basically feels like a weaker, less impactful, and more forgettable version on the end section of the previous track. There's some alright organ progressions going on behind it, but also some particularly annoying and shrill flute performances that remind me of like a little kid learning to play the recorder or something. And then Resurrection makes for a fairly anticlimax ending as well. It is trying to go for this kind of creepy satanic idea with its intense church-like organs and the reversed spoken sermon from Froisy, which, if you play it backwards, reveals him to just be reading a disclaimer off the back of a ferry ticket about, like, needing to procure the proper documents for immigration officers. I mean, I guess it's not an idea I'd heard elsewhere on the album, but it just kind of happens. It's just kind of there. and then it runs through some other mildly creepy organ passages that don't really leave any impact on me before fading out unceremoniously. I mean, while I'm at it, every track on here, besides Genesis and Cold Smoke, which segue into their following tracks, end in oddly abrupt fade-outs like that. Like, the endings just kind of come from out of nowhere, and yeah, that's it. So, yeah, and I don't know. But, yeah, that's Electronic Meditation. It's okay. It has fun parts, but kind of loses me in its second half. I made the point earlier that I see Tangerine Dream as kind of like the Simpsons of electronic music, but that parallel goes a little further than I mentioned earlier. Because if you've ever seen the first season of The Simpsons, like, that show also has a pretty rough start. Showing occasional promise of what would come, but not really landing most of its jokes, feeling very off and awkward, and like the writers and actors hadn't quite found their footing yet. And that's kind of the vibe I get off of this album, too. This album isn't bad for what it is. I can see having its audience who can get into the sheer freakiness of it all, but the band clearly didn't have their identity or core appeal nailed down yet. Stuff like this isn't really a good demonstration of why Tangerine Dream is as well remembered as they are, or of why Konrad Schnitzler or Klaus Schulze are as well remembered as they are, for that matter. By the time this album came out, both had already broken off the band to focus on their solo work, leaving Froese to rebuild the band from scratch. This album is definitely a neat curiosity, like, you know, this one-off collaboration between these three legends that would never happen again, and sounds absolutely nothing like what you would expect off of their reputations from today. And as we get through the next handful of albums, you'll be able to trace a fairly linear progression from this all-experimental rock sound here into the synth soundscapes they're really known for. But is Electronic Meditation an essential piece of their catalog that you absolutely need to hear? And not really. I'd personally just save it for the diehards. The really good stuff is yet to come. So yeah, I'm on this album, I'm overall feeling like a 6.3 out of 10. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.